welcome to Backyard Composting. I'm sure that you've heard nobody else is doing this anywhere else. I'm sure you've never seen a video on this lately. So welcome. Get ready to have your minds blown. I'm just kidding. That's probably not true. You guys have probably seen a lot of these videos already. I'm just going to reiterate a little bit of the type of composting that we do at McDowell, and also just trying to encourage people to compost because it's really, really simple. And there are a couple of easy mistakes that people make that make them quit. So I'm going to talk about how to solve those quickly, and then we're going to go on from there. I'm just, like I said, show you what we do here, and then show you a time lapse of what vermicomposting looks like, which is another type that we're going to talk about quickly as well, and then explore another thing that we do here for composting at camp. So let's start with our 3-chambered compost system here. All right, so Webster's dictionary defines compost. Just kidding, I don't know. It'd be great if I knew what it actually said though, wouldn't it? But I like to think of compost as a mixture of a bunch of different things, and that's what it is. And we use it as a soil additive, but it turns into almost 100% organic matter that you're going to add to your soil. So think of it as a boost that you can give to whatever you're trying to grow. There's a lot of people that think of compost as a fertilizer, and while compost is providing some nutrients for your plants, it doesn't produce all of them, so it's not going to be the equivalent of putting like Miracle-Gro on your plants. So you need to do a combination of a couple of things. But what compost does is compost increases your soil's health, which is huge when you want to grow plants. And a lot of people just think maybe just add some fertilizer in there real quick, boom, my plant goes up, and that does happen. But what happens is, in the long term, your soil health will actually be reduced. So we're all about building our soil health up, and compost is a great way to do that. So that your soil will continue to produce plants for a long time, instead of just that instant gratification of a really big plant for one season. So how compost works is compost starts off as a bunch of different things, and all of those things that you're going to be putting in the compost pile are made up of living things, cells. So if it is not made up of a cell at some point, even thinking about paper, because at some point paper was made of trees or it came from somewhere else. So at some point it was made up of a living thing. So anything like that goes into a compost pile. And anything that's not made up of a living thing, so we're talking about like plastics and metals, those things, you don't want to put those in your compost pile. So we're going to stick to just the basic stuff today. And when thinking of composting, you have 3 main things. The first thing is going to be the living organisms that you're hoping to draw into your compost pile. That's things like fungi, bacteria, and then all types of invertebrates. Those are the things that you want to draw to your compost pile. So what you're going to do is create the proper ingredients to get those things into your compost pile. And that is where you start with browns, and browns are going to be your carbon, and then greens, and greens are going to be your nitrogen. And plants are really, really going to dig that nitrogen. So when I think of colors, I think of browns as things that are older, so things that were once living but have died a long time ago. So examples of that, if we'll come right over here, I'll show you some examples real quick. So if you look at this, you see some colors here. Here are leaves. You can find leaves anywhere. If there's a tree, you're gonna find some leaves. I went over here with a rake, and in about 5 minutes got this massive pile of leaves. These are an excellent source of carbon for your compost bin. If you just take a pile of leaves and you leave it in your yard, say for instance, I don't know, the fall's around and you make a big pile of leaves for your kids, and then you don't do anything with those leaves, they just make this big black mass in your yard. If you dig up to the bottom of that, you're gonna see a bunch of really, really nutrient-rich soil that was created by these leaves. So these are an excellent source of carbon for your compost pile. So if you see one of your neighbors rakes up their leaves, puts them on the side of the road, you can take those and use them for your compost pile. But, all right, so leaves, great source of carbon. We're going to use those. Another source of carbon that we use on the farm is hay or straw. And this is, we cut one of our cover crops, and most of this is ryegrass. We cut one of our cover crops down, rake some of it up, and we're going to add it to our compost pile. So this is also considered a brown. A big concern you have when adding grasses, whether they be alive or living, is that if they've gone to seed, then those seeds could be reproduced and create new grass in your compost pile. Now, the way you keep that from happening is make sure that your compost pile is working. That compost pile, if it's working correctly and there's a lot of movement, can generate heats up to 160 degrees or more. So if you get to that 140 degree, you're going to eliminate any seeds that are in there from germinating. It will not happen if you can reach that 140 degree temperature, and you keep that temperature for a couple of days. And it's very, very easy to do that. So we'll take this, add this as a carbon layer. So this came from our farm. This is stuff that would either go back into our soil, a lot of really good organic matter, or we raked a little bit of it, maybe feed it to our animals, or put it in our compost pile. Now, today, quickly, I have one of those push lawnmowers that I rarely use these days, but it's got one of those awesome bags on it, and it's got a mulch function. And what that means is it chops your grass up into tiny pieces and sucks it into that bag. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? So if you're not gonna leave that stuff on your yard to decompose and enrich your soil, and you do bag it, you can turn it into compost. Come get a closer look. This is from like 10 minutes of cutting grass. These are greens. Now, the difference here is these are recently deceased plants. So you notice that the coloring is green. You can leave these, and these are gonna be a source of nitrogen for your compost pile. Notice that there's also some browns in here. You can take these as well, and they're just gonna continue to add mass and carbon to your compost pile. But this all came from my yard today. And some people also may take this and put this on the curb. Or, you know, some people take it and just dump it in other parts of their yard. But you can take this and use this for your compost. And here's some of the waste that we got from today. Okay, so we're talking about the greens that are gonna go in your compost pile, which is your source of nitrogen. And for us on a large scale farm like this, what I'm gonna go to is I'm gonna do a quality control on a couple of things out here, and I'm gonna take some of the bottom leaves that maybe aren't photosynthesizing as much, maybe pulling some energy from the plants that we don't need that to happen right now. So I'm gonna take some of them off, and then we're gonna tear those up and throw them into our compost pile. So I'm gonna start with some of this broccoli and broccolini that we go in here. So you're gonna be careful when you're doing something like this, even if you're doing it at your house. You're gonna make sure that what you get does not have a current pest on it. So you don't wanna add things into your compost pile that you don't want. So if you have something like aphids, those aren't things that you're gonna want in your compost pile. So adding anything that is covered in aphids is just gonna draw more aphids in and bring in things that you don't want. So if I'm looking through here, I usually go to the bottom section of these leaves, and I'll take smaller stuff off like this. And then I'm really looking at this too to make sure there's nothing terrible in here. There's a little bit of decomposition going here, but all in all, there's nothing living on here that I can see. So I can add something like that, and I'll just go through and take these bottom ones off. They're being blocked out by the upper leaves anyway, so they're not really contributing too much as far as energy production goes for this plant. So I can pull these guys off and use them. Also, once that broccoli plant's been finished, you're gonna get one cut off of it, especially if it's a head broccoli. And then when you're done, you can actually take that plant out of the ground and add that to your compost pile. So for us, it's just a way of us not wasting anything here. So we're able to recycle plants and turn them into soil that will grow more food that we can eat later. So if we come back over here too, there's some broccoli growing right here that's pretty much ready to harvest. We can check it out. All right, so we're moving over here to some of this broccoli that's already starting to sprout for us. This is a type of head broccoli, so you'll get one cut off of this, and you may get some side shoots from it. But once you've made that one cut, you can go ahead and take this plant out of the ground, add it to your compost pile. So we can go ahead and do this now, actually, and then move it on later. This one's about ready to go. So I'll take this and make a harvest on it, and I'm gonna get a little bit low on it here. And then I can take this plant, eat it. It's wonderful. And then take the rest of this plant over here and put it in our compost pile. So we can just pull it up. And one thing too, when you're pulling plants out of anywhere that you're growing, out of your garden space, raised bed, whatever, you're gonna try to make sure that anything that looks like soil, you wanna keep it in there. So we're gonna keep this soil and put it in here. And you see some mycelium on here. We're gonna keep all this stuff in our soil, because you're gonna be building your soil up for years. So making sure that you're not taking soil from here is a great thing, because we're gonna turn around and put compost back into here. So we'll take this, we use this for our pile as well. It's perfect, it's wonderful. You can take all these, break them off in tiny pieces. Here, tiny, 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 tiny. Here, you can chop these up with a knife. You can do anything you want to. We're gonna throw it in the bucket. Let's grab some more stuff. Okay, and this is another source of nitrogen for our compost pile. It's food waste. Anything at your house that you want to add in that's left over from cooking, so say you're chopping up onions, all the other stuff that you're not going to use that onion, say you didn't decide to make pesto with the top of that carrot, you can take that stuff, you can put in your compost pile as well. Things that you don't really want to put in your compost pile are meats. Some people do that and they do it well, but that has to do with a really, really high intense composting that takes place in a large scale. And we really typically don't do that here, because the meats, if you do it on a small scale, will draw in the kind of stuff that you don't want. I know cities have raccoons, cities have possums, coyotes in some cities, cats are definitely in some cities, so are dogs. And these will draw those things, and they'll draw a lot more flies than you want as well. You want to try to avoid dairy as well. Another thing you don't want to put in your compost pile, you can put eggshells. You'll notice when I go through these compost piles, there's a ton of eggs in here. You don't want to overdo the eggshells, but you can put some in there. And you're also going to want to avoid any type of citrus fruit. The acidity it kind of messes with the consistency of your compost pile. And it's not going to, it takes them a long time to break down, especially peels. So try to avoid putting that stuff in there if you can. All right, one last thing for a really good brown is a really good old creosote post. We like to throw these in there as well. I'm just kidding, you don't want to do this. It's just old stuff we have over here on this pile. I think we burned some of it up. This is definitely not things you're going to want to put in your compost pile. But old sweet potatoes like we have here, we'll definitely chop these up and put them in our compost pile. All right, at camp we do a lasagna method of composting, and that means you're layering different greens and browns. You can even add some soil into it as well, and I'm going to show you how to do that in this process. But this was a system built by kids in one of our Hard at Work classes, and it's held up for a long time. All it is a T-post and pallets. It's time to replace it. We realize that. Don't judge us too hard. But like I said, this was thrown up by kids in like 2 hours, and it's lasted us for multiple years. So what you do in a 3-chambered compost system is you flip your compost into another chamber. That way you can always have 3 different piles of compost working. Start with your layered system here, and then when it's time to flip it, and that's usually a couple of weeks, say 2 to 3, you flip it to the next chamber. And what you're doing in that flipping process is you're aerating that compost. So what you're doing is you're putting oxygen in there, because what makes compost work is all the different organisms inside of that pile. That's that fungi, the bacteria, and all those little invertebrates and microbes doing the work. They create heat, but they also use oxygen just like we do. So what you do is when you flip that compost pile, you're giving oxygen to all those organisms, and we call it aerating, and it really boosts production. So you flip it to the second chamber, and then you get to start a new compost pile in your first chamber. So your second chamber is cooking here, and after a couple of weeks, your second chamber needs to be aerated again, and it's ready to be flipped. And also that new one that you created needs a place to go, because it's time for it to be flipped as well. So you flip the second chamber into the third chamber, and by this time it's almost ready for composting. And if you're checking heat, you want it to be really, really warm. You want it to be over 100. A lot of times you can do this during the winter, and that compost pile can be 40 degrees or 60 degrees warmer than it is outside. The more heat, the better in a compost pile. So, but what you have here is 3 different ages of compost. So this is really, really new compost that we've been adding to over the past week or two. And this is compost that's over a month old, and then this is compost over here that's almost 2 months old. And this stuff's almost ready to be sifted through before we can put it onto our field. So looking at the different sections of our compost here, you can see that there's a lot more browns visible here in this, but when I move this out of the way, you're also going to see a lot of fresh compost in the form of food waste. So seeing here that we have some food waste is starting to break down. You can put coffee grounds in here. You see some eggs broken up in there. There's a couple of peels. There's even a piece of paper right here. Looks like somebody's napkin. You don't want to put too much of that kind of stuff in there, but that will eventually break down as well in compost. So what I try to do is always, anytime I have a layer of food waste, I try to cover that with a layer of browns, because what will happen is that'll attract things into your compost pile that you don't want, and that's where you start getting into smells. So if your compost pile smells really terrible, that means you have too much nitrogen, and it starts getting slimy. So how do you fix that? You add more carbon. Leaves, you can even use small broken sticks. That's the kind of stuff you add. And when you do that, it'll create bulk to your compost pile, and it'll also reduce the amount of moisture that's being created, and the smell will get better. So that's how you fix a stinky compost pile, which is why most people quit composting, because their compost pile stinks. So if it's stinky, add browns, and add a bunch of them. The ratio in a compost pile of browns to greens is typically 1 to 4. 4 being 4 browns and 1 part green. So you're gonna get a lot more concentrated nitrogen in the food waste that you add into it and the grass clippings than you are in a very, very large scale amount of leaves, because these leaves take up a lot more space, and there's a lot more space between them as well. So remember, way more browns than greens. So this is our first steps in here. So I'm gonna add some of these to this, and then I'm gonna show the layering method that we'll do, and then I'm gonna show you our finished compost. Check out our second compost pile and see what's happening. You're gonna see, more than likely, some stuff that hasn't been broken down yet. I'm just gonna take it and flip it a little bit so you can see what we got going on. And what's kind of broken down and what hasn't. Most of your leafy stuff, that stuff's gonna break down super fast. Notice that we have some eggshells in here. Haven't broken down all the way. It takes them a pretty long time to break down. Looks like we also have an onion in here. Now, we added this onion, and it's starting to decompose pretty hard. It's got some really awesome juice going on in there, but if we would have chopped this up to begin with, this thing would have broken down a lot faster. So you can take this, since it's not broken down, and I'm probably gonna add it over here to my other compost pile. But most of this stuff's starting to change. When you go through composting, you're gonna hope that a chemical change takes place. So, you know, physical change is when I'm taking those leaves and ripping them apart. But a chemical change is when when something becomes something else. It's changed into something completely different, and that's what compost is. And that's created by all that heat. So that chemical change is already starting to take place in my second compost pile, which is really exciting. Some of the stuff hasn't broken down all the way, but that's why we have 3 piles. We'll take this, flip it over to our third pile. Let's check that third pile out and see what it looks like. So I'm gonna take a big scoop of this. I'm gonna put it over here on my sifter and see what we come up with. And I'm looking, and as I'm doing this, kind of looking for worms, I'm also sifting this compost. Notice we have a screen here. This just gets any of that big stuff that hasn't broken down, and we can put that back in another pile because it needs more time. Here's a nice one. So the worms we're looking for are gonna go into a vermicomposting bin. Now, you're hopefully gonna have worms in your compost pile, but they're gonna be teaming up with all kinds of organisms for that composting. When you're dealing with vermicomposting, you're strictly gonna be depending on worms to do the breaking down for you. And the result is worm castings. And they're a little bit more nutrient rich than normal composting. And watching them work is a lot of fun. And you can do it. And notice when you're looking at these worms do really, really well on dark surfaces. They really don't like sunlight. You also notice that worms are always kind of moist and slimy looking. And worms need to be moist and slimy in order to breathe because they're breathing through their skin. Really neat creatures. You can do a lot of little harmless experiments on worms just to kind of figure out, you know, how they operate and help you kind of build that compost pile out. And that's fun to figure out, you know, do worms like leafy greens or do they like things like carrots more? And you can do a really basic experiment by just putting a worm in a piece of Tupperware or anything like that, or even a napkin, and seeing where they go. Put a carrot on one side, put some lettuce on another, and if that worm goes to lettuce, then it's probably gonna prefer leafy greens. And they do, because it's easier to break down. So I'm not seeing a ton of worms in here. I'm gonna have to dig for some more. Maybe they're lower down in my pile, but I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of keep pushing this down and sifting it. Notice that I got some fun stuff still in here that hasn't broken down all the way. Once it's been sifted, then you have some compost ready to go put in your soil. You can sift this stuff again if you'd like to. I still don't really like the amount of eggshells, but it's okay, it'll be great. So you can do a triple sift. You can sift it 100 times if you want to. It's just your preference. We usually sift it once. So that's the composting process here at McDowell. I'm gonna show you quickly our vermicomposting that we do here, and that'll kind of lead into the vermicomposting that we're going to set up that you can do at home. It's really simple. We're going to use the lasagna method. We're going to use an aquarium in a dark area, and we're going to use worms that we've collected from our own soil. And if you're looking for a place to get worms, Big Jim's Worm Farm, double thumbs up online. You probably appreciate that business. All right. So here at McDowell Farm School, we do not only traditional 3-chamber composting, but we also have vermicomposting where we do worms, and that's an in-ground system that I'm going to briefly show you. We also do a black soldier fly composting, which is an amazing system that we're going to do a video on later on, so make sure you check that one out. Really, really cool. Let's start here. I'm going to show you how this thing works. It's built underground, so it stays cool. Worms like it dark, they like it cool, they don't like it to get too hot. And inside of this, you're going to notice some worm castings, and look how dark and beautiful that is. And we feed that very similar to how you feed a normal compost pile. you're just going to up the amount of worms in here. So worms are just chewing through all of this, and once they chew it, they defecate, chew it, defecate, and they just continue to do that. And what you end up with are worm castings, and you get this really, really nutrient-rich additive to your soil. So we'll take this and add it into plants throughout the season. So we continuously work this. These are more of our browns that haven't broken down. We just kind of scooted them to the side. But looking through this stuff's wonderful. And you can throw eggshells in here, they'll break through this. You can use paper for this. Just make sure that you shred that paper up. And we're gonna do some of that in the video, and you'll see what we do there. But this is the end result of a really good vermicomposting. Also, be careful if you're doing anything underground. But we have a black widow that lives right here. She's right over here. She has been here for a really long time, and we always know that she's here, so we pay attention. If she'll flip over, you can see that perfect hourglass on her belly. But she lives in here and cleans up on all the different insects that it attracts. And we don't mess with her because she's getting in there and feeding on some stuff that we don't want in there messing with our worms. But we are aware of her. I think that's really important to know different organisms that are out there and being aware of, the jobs that the purpose that they have, but also having the fear that you need to for a black widow because they're lethal. All right, hopefully you've lasted this long and you're ready to move on to the next phase of this video. We showed you all the different types of composting done at the farm school at Camp McDowell. And we're gonna talk about a way that you can set up vermicomposting at your house. Really, really simple. And we're gonna do it in an aquarium because we wanna watch that process, but you can do it in anything. You can do it in some Tupperware. You can do it in a bowl with a lid on it. You can do it in a 5-gallon bucket like the one I have over there. Let's see what we do here, and I'll show you the types of stuff you can feed into it, and then we'll look at the progress of what happens inside of that vermicomposting bin over a couple of days. And the end result, hopefully, is going to be some stuff that's really, really close to vermicomposting that we can use to put out in our garden. So good luck, everybody. Let's check out the next part. So we're going to dig into making your own vermicomposting center in your house. Now, if you have a small aquarium like this one, amazing. If you have a mason jar like this one, you could possibly do this just for an experiment. This is not something that we're trying to create a ton of vermicomposting for. We're doing this just to kind of show you what the layering method can be like, because worms really, really prefer darkness. So obviously with anything like this, we're gonna have to put this in a dark room. But if you had it something that was dark completely, then you could put it out in the open. You can always cover these things as well, but you want to mimic that darkness, because that bright light will dry out worm skin, and therefore they can't breathe. So it's one of the things that worms need, is they need moisture to breathe. So that's going to make sure that we add a tiny bit of water to this as well. So what we have in front of us, and we're just going to review what we have. We have our browns, and what nutrient or chemical are we adding with our browns? That's right, carbon. You remember. Good job. We have some fresh lawn clippings that we added before from my house. They are green. They're one of our greens. Now, if they were to sit out for a really, really long time, they might become one of our browns. But right now, they are one of our greens. Which one of our elements do these represent? Not oxygen. That's right. Nitrogen. Good job. More greens here. These are some more vegetable waste from earlier. Here's part of the broccoli that was in my pocket that I ate some of it. Some of it fell in the compost. Ate more of it. We're going to use it. We have more leafy greens here in the form of some of the broccoli that we pulled off earlier. And then I grabbed some turnip greens from earlier. These are all going to be our leafy vegetables that we're going to add into our vermicomposting bin here, because worms really, really love leafy greens. You can add other things to your compost pile for worms, so your vermicompost bin. You can add all kinds of food waste from cooking. The greener, the better, though. Anything that's hard, so if you were to add like an onion, or you wanted to add a carrot or a radish, you can't add those things, and they will eat those things, but it's going to really, really slow your process down. You're looking for something that's going to break down super fast, and those worms are just going to run right through it. In any kind of leafy green, that's the way to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to layer this. And remember what we talked about with ratios. If you're looking at my piles here, which pile's bigger? Correct, carbon, right here. Now, there's a lot more space in here, if you notice that as well. When you're dealing with carbons, they are adding space to it, so they're also helping to aerate, but you got to add more of these. And remember, not enough carbons equals smells. That works the same thing with a vermicomposting pile, just like it does in a regular composting pile. So, lots of carbon. Greens are going to go next in a layer. Okay, you can use paper. You don't want to use too much of it, but you can definitely shred paper, because worms will go right through it. Do you think that's a green or a brown? Or a white? It's going to be considered one of the browns, so it's going to add carbon to your pile. It is white, but don't let that fool you. Think about where it came from. Think about what it was before. Remember that at one point, part of this was made up of cells. This will break down. This can add to your vermicompost. So what we're going to do, we're going to layer these up. I'm going to shred these apart. And then what I did earlier is I went spelunking for worms, and I grabbed a ton. Now, I had to go deep because it's a warm day, but I did manage to steal some of the worms from our compost pile outside. I'm going to pick these out, and then we're going to add these to our vermicomposting bin that we're creating. Like I said, you can do this with anything. You want to make sure that you have air. So if you do want to get a like a Tupperware container, make sure that if you do have a lid on it, that there is air available to those worms, because they do need that oxygen flowing in there to increase the amount of breakdown that's taking place. So make sure that it's not completely sealed. You want to keep it in a dark area. Worms like dark spaces. Okay, you're not going to see any type of worm that you see out in a really bright, well-lit space that's dry. That worm is usually what? Not living, correct. That's right. So we're looking for a happy place for worms. Like I said, if you want to get with your kiddos, or you want to do an experiment with yourself, you can take a worm and really, really figure out what worms like. And that will impact what you put in your vermicomposting bin, because what you're doing is your bedding is going to be a place that worms really want to be. And if they really want to be there and they're really happy because you're feeding them all the time, they will produce a ridiculous amount of worm casting for you, which benefits your garden space. So today, let's go ahead and put some of this stuff together. The finer these things are, the more shredded up they are, the tinier they are, the better. Worms' mouths are not gigantic, so they're going to eat through things. Fun fact about worms. Worms do not have teeth. So you ask, how do they break their food down? Well, worms, like our friends the chickens that we learned about the other day, they have gizzards. Isn't that amazing? Worms and chickens both have gizzards. That's how they grind up their food. So they take their food, they swallow it. It goes into a gizzard. And remember that gizzard's kind of like a muscled sleeve that contracts and it breaks down. So worms, like chickens, also have to eat minerals. So they're taking tiny pieces of rocks and they're swallowing those, because that helps to grind their food up inside of that gizzard. Why does that benefit us? Because those minerals that they're taking to help grind up their food also come out in worm castings. And those minerals go into the soil, which is what your plants also need to grow. So that's one of the benefits that you're getting with really, really concentrated worm poop or worm castings, is that you get those added minerals in there. And that really, really boosts your soil. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with some browns. Now, like I said earlier, I'm going to shred these up. And I'm going to get them as fine as I can. I'm going to break them up really hard. You're also going to see me add some pressure in here, because I'm going to try to compact this as much as I can. Those worms will just work right through it. They'll create space as they go through. So anything that can be torn up here, I'm going to tear it up. I'm going to add a little layer of green. And notice that the amount of green that's going in here is less than the amount of browns. I'm going to throw some more brown in here. Any kind of big sticks like this, because I'm doing it in a small scale, and I want this to happen really fast, I'm going to take them out. If you're doing it on a large scale, you can leave that stuff in, because it's going to break down, just because of speed. So what I'm trying to make sure is everything in here is stuff that's going to break down really fast. So pushing it down, breaking it up. There's a little bit of pine straw in there. You can want to try to avoid pine straw if you can. Takes a little bit longer to break down. So notice how I'm pushing it down continuously, just like that. I'm going to go in and add some more greens. Now I can take this and just shred it up as fine as I can. If you chop it up, it's even better. You take it and chop it up in a time, just like you're going to cook it. So any of your food waste, like those carrot tops. I say carrot tops because we've been eating a ton of carrots around here. Everybody has carrots. So we've been trying to figure out how to use the greens from carrots. And we've been using them. But the stuff that we're not using, chopping up and throwing in our compost, which is great. So putting in this in here, I'm going to add this to my pile. I'm going to keep just tearing stuff up. Okay, so if you are doing a vermicomposting bin at home, you want to make sure that whatever you're using, there are holes in the bottom of it, because through all of this, you're going to create some liquid. It's just going to happen. Now, you can take that liquid and you can drink it. I'm just kidding, don't drink it.
But you can actually take that liquid and you can put it in your garden if you'd like to, and put it on your plants as a fertilizer, because there will be nutrients and minerals in that soil, or in that juice that comes out. So you can collect that. For the sake of what we're doing here, though, we don't have an outlet for that. So we're not going to be producing a ton of that because of the scale of this. So we don't have to worry so much about the amount of liquid running out the bottom of this. It may get tiny bit soggy here at the bottom of it, but for the purposes of this video and what we're doing, it's not that big of a deal. But at home, you don't want all that moisture just building up at the bottom, so poke a couple of holes at the bottom of it. If you're worried about your worms getting out of those holes, if you make sure that your bedding is right and you're feeding that vermicomposting bin, even if it's a small scale one like some Tupperware one, or a big one like a wooden one, or the one like we have that's underground, those worms will stay there. If you're providing a great environment for them and they have food and they have shelter, it stays cool under there, there's not a ton of light getting to it, they're going to live there and they won't go anywhere. So that's to your advantage. So the holes are going to be okay. But I'm going to add a little bit of liquid just to get started. If you ever notice that your vermicomposting bin's drying out, you're going to want to add a little bit of liquid. And that's for the worms themselves. And I don't know if we talked about this or not, but one thing that worms need is moisture on their skin because it helps them breathe. And if that moisture isn't happening, those worms will dry out. So too much moisture is a bad thing. Not enough moisture is also a bad thing. So we're just going to add a little bit. You can do this periodically. If you're doing this on a large scale, every 2 weeks you may want to add a little bit of water. So I'm just going to put just a little bit in here. Like I said, not a lot. I just want to, all this stuff's pretty dry right now. I just want to moisten it up a little bit. And then I'm going to add a little bit of soil on top of this that I collected from our compost pile. And if you want to take some soil from around your house as well and add it to the top, it just kind of gives it a kickstart. So I'm going to add a little bit of soil on top here. And then the last thing I'm going to add are my worms. So things that we know about worms, we know that worms prefer really, really dark areas. So what do you think is going to happen if I add the worms on top of this? Where do you think they're going to go? Think they're going to climb out the sides and leave? We're going to find out here in a second, but probably not. They're going to be looking for a dark area. And luckily for us, underneath all of this is going to be a dark area. Now, light can get in through all sides of this. So we're going to keep this in a dark area or keep it covered. Same thing for your composting bin. You want to make sure that it's in a cool area. You want to make sure that it's where sunlight's not directly hitting it because you don't want it to turn into an oven that's going to be cooking your worms. So you want to make sure that it's cool and it's under shade. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of this soil that I collected from the compost pile. And then on top of this, I'm going to add my worms. I'm going to put them right here on top. Spread them out just a little bit. They formed a ball. And then we're going to see where they go. And usually per square foot, about a pound of worms is ideal. Obviously, this is not a pound of worms. The more worms, the better. But also the more you have to feed it. So feel free to add as many worms as you want to. Not enough worms, it's just going to take longer. The more worms you have, the quicker it's going to last, but the more you have to feed it. So let's see what happens.
Hey, thanks for joining us on our video today. Look forward to talking to you guys again in the future. Make sure you stay tuned for our next ones. We're gonna have a Black Soldier Fly one coming up, but compost, you can do it, it's not hard. If it's stinky, add some leaves. If it gets all liquidy and gross and disgusting and you're trying the wrong things, like I said, always add those carbons, it'll help. Don't give up because it didn't work the first time, and continue to try. So use the things that you have, try to reduce the amount of waste at your house. Take all those leftover choppings, put them in your compost pile. And good luck with that. Hope everybody's doing great. See you next time here at the Farm School. Cam McDowell.